Okay, so welcome back and good morning and welcome to then the following chapter. This is the fourth chapter on cinema. And I ended last week with looking at some of the British war films of the 1950s and their slight difficulty in presenting the war in a way that that put British valor and intelligence at the center of it. In the 50s, sorry, yes, I spoke about that one already. In the late 50s, you got the beginnings of a group of film directors who wanted cinema to be used to exhibit and to even to protest about social problems, or even just simply to valorize the lives of ordinary people. So, for example, in 1957, Lindsay Anderson brought forward this one, Every Day Except Christmas, which is a documentary about Covent Garden, which was the huge fruit and vegetable wholesale markets. Now, this is interesting that the documentaries at the cinema. And I think it's worth remembering that 1957 is the first year when television overtakes radio. I think it's in the spending of the BBC. So remember that for most of the 50s, although television was in and rising, many people only had radio, and therefore the cinema was particularly important. Films were changing then in the 50s, the late 50s. They were in particular transformed by the invention of the portable camera, that you could walk around and film instead of being with these huge things that needed wheels. In any case, these social films, including Lindsay Anderson, who they worked together and used the expression free cinema. They like to think of themselves as free cinema. And this led to a group of realistic and groundbreaking dramas, including Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and A Kind of Loving. Other British films helped to give a wider idea of what could be shown on screen. So Alfie, for example, with Michael Caine, which is a film about a gentleman, probably the wrong word, a man who runs two families at once, if I remember correctly, and hides one relationship from the other. In any case, it was considered to be avant-garde because it showed a little bit more sex and nudity on screen than had been possible previously. And interestingly enough, there was a remake made many years later in the 21st century. This is always very interesting when 1950s films are remade later, because that would tend to show that the way that they looked at the problems had not changed. What else do we have here? Yes, one of the other films before this one of the other films of this series is one called Billy Liar, which is about a liar, yeah. Now, it has to be said that the presentation of women in these films is very doubtful. They are seen as keen to have a washing machine and a vacuum cleaner, or otherwise about tricking men into marriage, perhaps by deliberately falling pregnant. In any case, the men are always at the center of the story. A slight exception would be a very fine film of 1961, A Taste of Honey, which is the rather depressing life of a young single mother, and this talks about various taboo subjects at the time. In the 50s, we also had a series of a few series of comic films that perhaps vaguely the equivalent for another country and another decade of the films about Les Bronzés in France. That is to say, as you say in French, ça ne vole pas forcément très haut. And so the first series is on the right here. You can see Doctor in the House, and there was a whole series of Doctor in the House, Doctor at Sea, about young doctors. And there you go. You can probably find some of these on YouTube if you're interested. And on the other hand, the series of Carry On films, Carry On Doctor, Carry On Nurse, Carry On Cleopatra, Carry On Follow That Camel, and many, many more. Okay, so these are rather lighter comedies. There was also a few school comedies. These are usually set in private schools. The Bells of St. Trinian's, which are the adventures of young and rather undisciplined girls in a girls' school. And probably one of the best ones, this is actually in 1950, The Happiest Days of Your Life. Now, this story happens during the war. And since the girls' school has been commandeered, they decide to send the whole school to share the buildings of another school. However, the other school is boys only, and just at this moment in these private schools, there is meant to be groups of parents, very bourgeois parents, are going to visit each school. And so what they have to do is they try to organize the school day so that one group of visitors only sees boys and the other group of visitors only sees girls. It's extremely good, and it's fairly mocking. Yeah. So this reflects the fact that most schools at the time were single sex, but this disappeared almost completely between 55 and 75. Britain was also capable at the time of putting forward horror films, in particular by the Hammer Studio. And here we have a couple of examples: The Horror of Dracula and The Curse of Frankenstein. There was also Quatermass and The Mummy, and so on and so forth. In the 60s, there was a certain number of British films dealing with music, most famously the Beatles films, A Hard Day's Night and then Help, rather strange comedies, a little wild, no doubt parodies in some sense, but this was a very interesting idea to try to make the most of these hugely popular singers by getting them into a film, and also including some of their Liverpool humour. And on the right is the Young Ones with Cliff Richard. This is later on in the century there will be a television series called The Young Ones. There is no connection. Well, there is a connection, but not much of a connection. And so the Beatles would go on to do Yellow Submarine, but there was also some success with one or two musical comedies in the Hollywood style, but very British in another way. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, for example, 1968. Lindsay Anderson, who we mentioned as the author of some of these social films, sometimes referred to as kitchen sink dramas, made a very remarkable film, If, which is about life in a private school again, but it's very much more a rebellious film against the disciplined life of a private boys boarding school, young men's boarding school. And this is a much more serious film, and it's still taken very seriously today. It's philosophical and fantastic and extremely critical of private schools in any case. Now, interestingly enough, the next generation of British directors will be mostly trained by television and not directed by cinema. This is for a whole period in the 60s and 70s. So those British directors who are well known today, or have been well known in the last 20 years, Ken Loach, Ken Russell, Stephen Frears, Mike Leigh, or indeed the Monty Python team, will all begin at the BBC, and very often a lot in the series The Wednesday Play. The Wednesday Play was every Wednesday, as its name suggests, when they put on a play written for television. This was something that existed at the time, that they called them television plays, although they were not played on a stage, but they were supposed to be taken more seriously than cinema or television films. Also documentaries. We have this piece, which was actually made for television, but was only shown in the cinema for a very long time. There's a Peter Watkins, who will later make a very long film about the Paris Commune. But in this case, it's the war game, and it's I suppose it isn't really a documentary. It's a sort of speculative documentary about what will happen if there is a nuclear attack on Britain. Now, I ought to say that if today people are very worried about climate change, at the time in the 1960s, especially the end of the 1960s, people were really genuinely very, very frightened of a nuclear war. On the one hand, the United States, and on the other hand, Russia were accumulating nuclear weapons, and each side had enough to destroy the other side several times over. When there were points of tension, as there had been at the beginning of the 1960s with the Cuban Missile Crisis, people were really very frightened that a nuclear war would take place, and that there would be hundreds of millions killed. Peter Watkins made this film for the BBC. The BBC asked him to make it, but when he'd made it, they refused to put it on television for 20 years. It wasn't, in fact, it was shown on BBC television for the first time in 1985. However, many people had seen it because the campaign for nuclear disarmament sent it round from town to town, playing in trade union halls or church halls, etc., as a political event. So since 1970, I want to have a look at some of the films produced, and these will tend to have fit into these categories, which I mentioned at the beginning: the heritage film, or the social film, the film about ordinary people's problems, or the comedy, it will be dominated by quite a small number of film directors, and no doubt the most notable is Ken Loach. So Ken Loach is still bringing out films today which are very successful. I know his last one, I can't remember the exact title, in 2019 was, I saw it discussed on the news, discussed on the French news, so it's having a certain success. So this is where in the 1970s, this is what Ken Loach was doing in the 1960s. Sorry, 1966, Kathy Come Home. These are the DVDs. So obviously the DVDs much later. There were no DVDs in the 1960s. Kathy Come Home. Then this film made for television about homelessness, and the more literary film, if you like, Kes. This is the story of a working class boy, the son of a miner, who has a hobby, which is to train a kestrel eagle. They are extremely difficult to train, and the whole film gives a lot of realistic pictures of the cruelty of schools in the 1950s, the dead-end prospects for working class children who often were not expecting to have a better job than their parents. And in this particular town, Barnsley, they were expecting to go down the pit just like their father had. For the boys, in any case. Also in the 1970s, then, sorry, that was the 1960s, the 1970s, I will come back to Ken Loach. In the 1970s, a series of musical films, then Ken Russell brought out this biography of Mahler, and this rather impressive rock opera, Tommy, which is a film about a deaf, dumb, and blind kid who wins the pinball championships, and it's very much it's very it's very sharp and cutting satire of some aspects of British society. Now, in the 1970s, the British cinema was having great difficulty because, on the one hand, they were having difficulty competing with television, which was now, first of all, in almost everybody's house, and secondly, more and more after 1970, was in color, and therefore, a more realistic challenge to cinema. And on the other hand, there was American cinema, which was proving to be extremely heavy competition. This is a time of blockbusters, Jaws, yeah, Les Dents de la Mer, the Disney blockbusters at the end of the 70s, Star Wars, and so on. And it was very difficult for British cinema to find the money to compete with either with the television or with American cinema. Many people believed that indeed that British cinema was just going to die out, that wasn't going to be any space for British cinema. And not attempting to compete with US cinema for blockbusters with special effects, British cinema survived, as I suggested at the beginning of this course, by working on a niche market level, that is to say, concentrating on a small number of specific kinds of films. Number one, heritage movies showing the great British bourgeois aristocratic past, and sometimes doing that through great British literature, Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre, and Jane Austen, and so on. Absurd comedy along the lines of, first of all, Monty Python, and then continuing along those lines. And finally, little by little, this new speciality, social realism, which will, a rather romantic social realism, which will be most clearly demonstrated by Ken Loach's films. Now, in the 1970s, an average film cost £300,000 to make, but would normally only make £70,000 in domestic ticket sales in the UK. And this means that if the British filmmakers want to make a film which makes money, and if it doesn't make money, you can't make the next one, they're obliged to make films which can be exported. And that was one of the things that Ken Russell succeeded very well with Marla and Tommy. Meanwhile, in the late 1960s, the government is again interested in the cinema, and Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, establishes a think tank on British cinema. This is also throughout the 60s and 70s is the golden age of James Bond, and the films of James Bond, the first of one of being 1962, Dr. No. The films of James Bond show up some of the anxieties and the preoccupations of the time. Very often they are rather xenophobic or even racist. For example, in Dr. No, the evil man is a Chinese doctor who wishes to attack American rockets. And you see in this the interest for nuclear weapons, which is an enormous debate at the time, because this is the time of a mass campaign against nuclear weapons. A little later in let's get this right, 1968, on Her Majesty's Secret Service, the aim of James Bond is to avoid a bacteriological war. So you can see we're close to the preoccupations of the time. Now, the James Bond films show that Britain can, from time to time, compete with American cinema with special effects and so on. But the figure of James Bond is very interesting, because the figure of James Bond is an attempt to project a comforting idea of what it means to be British in a world where, in fact, the role of Britain is getting smaller and smaller. The United States and the Soviet Union are the superpowers, and Britain is very much a secondary power. And indeed, during the Suez Crisis I already mentioned in 1956, the British ruling class discovered that really they can't do anything a long way from home without the success of the Americans. So what does James Bond represent? Well, I think that James Bond represents a fictional contribution to international politics. Perhaps Britain is no longer the most powerful. Notice that James Bond works on his own, or almost always on his own, but the British are the cleverest and manage to seduce all the girls. There's an interesting analysis of Bond, which has been produced, which suggests that Bond films are a sort of a game, that normally things happen in exactly the same way in every film. So the head of the Secret Service gives a task to Bond, to James Bond, The villain moves in and appears to Bond. Then the woman moves in and Bond goes to bed with her. And then the villain captures Bond and tortures him. And then he wins, goes to bed with the woman again, and then loses the woman. Now, these are fairly clearly linked inside a certain number of codes. First of all, a sexist code. One of the things is that Bond, by getting involved with women, cures women who are not proper women, and so, for example, some of the women in Bond movies are. It's suggested that they are lesbians, and what they really need is to go to bed with James Bond. So a very reactionary, anti-gay narrative in there. Otherwise, the women may be excessively virginal and refuse all the sexual side of their being. And again, their solution is British masculinity in the form of Bond. So Bond solves the problems of all girls by seducing them. So there's a pretty old-fashioned and macho view of what's going on there. And the other code, which is very clear in Bond films, is the imperialist code. That is, that Britain retains her superiority and finds a new role post-war and post-empire. Of course, the Bond films have gone on for many, many years. And whereas at the beginning, Bond is pitted against Soviet or Chinese enemies, later on, it is international terrorism which is his enemy. There's also plenty of racist coding in there. The West Indian or Asian or Mexicans are shown as irrational, superstitious, panicky, prone to meaningless violence, or just subhuman, whereas Bond is sophisticated, cool, and rational. Germans are shown as cold and calculating, while Greeks are warm and friendly. And indeed, there's nothing really surprising in this, because the author of the books, not of the films, but the books, Ian Fleming, was very clearly a racist author. And this has continued much later, of course, Casino Royale in 2006, and much later ones, the last one coming out, I think, last year. And there has, of course, been some changes. I remember that James Bond's boss in the most recent movie is a woman, which is reflecting reality, since the head of MI5, the British spy organization, has been at some point a woman, Stella Rimington, I believe. And so that's some of what has been possible with James Bond. Monty Python began working in the 70s with the Holy Grail and the Life of Brian, which I have already mentioned. But you can still see some political movies, some social movies. For example, this one, Song of the Shirt, by Sue Clayton, about women workers in the 19th century. And indeed another film called Comrades, which was the story of the Tolpuddle Martyrs. The Tolpuddle Martyrs, because they tried to establish a trade union in the mid-19th century, were arrested and sent off to Australia, and not on holiday to Australia, but to prison camp in Australia. So I have a couple of examples here of films from the 1990s. Yes, and in fact, indeed, these films are, I've lost my films now. Yeah, these are films by Stephen Frears. Stephen Frears then showing on the right. This is a film about racism. Not my favorite film, actually, but it's interesting to have a film about racism. And it's about an Indian immigrant who has married a white English woman, and they run a fish and chip shop. And indeed, in French, the film is entitled Fish and Chips. And it's about their lives, the conflict between cultures, and the conflict with race, with racists. However, I must admit that I don't think it's a very successful film. And one of the reasons is that in this film, there are like 99% of people who are not at all racist, not at all, and 1% of people who are extremely racist and stupid. Now, and of course, if racism was as simple as that, we would know about this. The Snapper again tries to examine social questions, and the particular social question here. Snapper is a baby, is a woman, a young woman, very young woman, who has a baby who becomes pregnant and refuses to tell her parents whose baby it is. I mean, who is the father, I should say. So yeah, that's the beginning. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to look at a series of important film directors and bring us more or less up to the present day. But that's in the next. That's going to be in the next chapter. So I'm going to stop this now if I find the right place to do so.